You are listening to the Opioid Affected Youth Initiative's podcast, Answering the Call. In each of the featured episodes, we will hear from experts from the field who will go in depth with their personal stories and experiences in responding to the opioid epidemic throughout communities across the country. This podcast is supported by the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. The opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of the U.S. Department of Justice.
Welcome to part one of our podcast series, Answering the Call. We want to take a deeper dive into the opioid crisis to further bring awareness to this epidemic in hopes of improving the physical and mental well-being of all. In today's segment, we are going to shift the conversation so that we can better understand the importance of taking a holistic approach to addressing this crisis. I am your host, Rhonda Shaw, with the Institute for Intergovernmental Research, and we are so excited to bring you this series and super excited for our honored guest, Miss Jessie Fairchild. Good to have you, Jessie.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Thank you so much. Jessie is an integrated, client-focused therapist with a theoretical orientation rooted in psychodynamic theory and contemplative psychology. She has a goal to create compassionate space for healing for individuals and the community at large, and she works with individuals, couples, families, and agencies to build on their existing strengths. She is a licensed clinical professional counselor and the owner of Bodhi, a mental health private practice that offers services to children and their families that have been affected by intergenerational cycles of trauma and substance use disorders. Jessie also works with the Department of Emergency Services to provide supports for first responders. Again, thank you, Jessie, for being here for this segment. I really appreciate you setting aside some time to have this discussion that I deem relevant and very much needed.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we've got such a huge crisis with the opioid epidemic and dual diagnosis and the idea of mental health and substance use being connected.
Yeah. So let's see if we can kind of shift this narrative a bit, okay, and provide our listening audience with a better understanding of taking that holistic approach to addressing this crisis. And maybe then we can also look at some strategies that can be integrated to strengthen these individuals that are affected, as well as strengthen and supporting our families so that our family units aren't dismantled. I want to start by saying that mental health professionals such as yourself, you are on the front lines. And what you do is essential to helping to combat this crisis. You're on the front lines of providing substance use disorder treatment. You're on the front lines of supporting clients that are faced with issues related to addiction. You're on the front lines of providing counseling to families and their loved ones that are being affected by addiction. So this opioid epidemic isn't this crime wave that's sweeping across our country, as some may think. It's a mental health crisis.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we're facing both a mental health crisis, and substance use is really a symptom of that. It's a symptom of despair. It's a symptom of sorrow, and it's a symptom of disconnection. And so I think oftentimes we look at substance use as the problem when actually it's what people are trying to make a solution to the problem, which then creates more problems.
Yes.
I don't think there's a segment of society that isn't affected by this, even when people think it's kind of an us and them problem, right? It's somebody over there who's struggling with this. But the truth of the matter is we're all affected. We're affected by the amount of resources it takes. We're affected by how it wears down our first responders. We're affected by how it wears down our second responders, which would be the mental health folks who are lining up to treat people. And we're affected by how it affects all of our agencies and community organizations.
Yeah. So I recently saw an article with NBC News, and they talked about 40% of the people living with addiction also live with another mental health challenge of some kind. So I want you to speak to how and why it seems these two disorders are in fact co-occurring.
Yeah, wow, that's a big question. So Yes, I think there's a lot of crossover between mental health and substance use. And some of that may be that people enter into substance use, enter into addiction to deal with stuff that's going on in their life, to deal with trauma, to deal with disconnection, to deal with difficult feelings. And then they develop mental health disorders, right? Like anxiety or depression as a result of the use of those substances. Or it can be that some people start with the mental health issue, the anxiety, the depression, or large or bipolar, schizophrenia, things like that. And they seek out some sort of self help or some sort of self medication through substances. So you can kind of enter it both ways, and there's a lot of crossover, and there's a lot of differences of opinion in terms of how we define these things too, right? Some people might say, oh, my teenager's drinking, right? That's not a big deal. Well, is it? I mean, that's substance use, right? Or they're smoking marijuana, not a big deal. Well, is it? It's substance use. Why are they doing these things? What are they trying to heal? What are they trying to deal with? So I think there's a lot of crossover, and there has historically been separation between mental health providers and substance use treatment professionals. And I think we're finding more and more that we really need to be able to approach it all with a compassionate stance and just saying, hey, what happened to you? What's going on in your life? How do I show up in a way that creates a relationship where you can start to look at these things and consider them and try to find a solution that doesn't cause you more problems?
Yeah. So, are there barriers to comprehensive treatment for individuals with these co occurring disorders?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So, one barrier would be that a lot of professionals, like I said, don't feel like they can treat both things when really we can with the right training, with the right support, and the right approach. It's possible. I think another barrier would be managed care. Right. So sometimes insurance companies are deciding how long someone should be in treatment or what they'll pay for, or whether someone actually has insurance and can come to the table. In our area, we've worked really hard to try to get funds that aren't linked to managed care so that we can offer supports to people, whether or not they have insurance, whether or not they have the right insurance, and whether or not they have the right insurance plan. Right. And then I think the other barrier is probably stigma, right? So people don't want to come forth and say, hey, I'm really struggling with this, right? They want it to be somebody else's problem, not something that's going on with them. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of, again, I keep coming back to the same thing, right? Creating a compassionate space where we can say, hey, being human's hard. Like suffering is everywhere. And we're living in a particularly difficult and fast paced time without a lot of the old resources that would support us. Community resources, church, faith, family, these things are changing and becoming different. And we haven't quite settled into how do we create some sort of web that takes care of people and helps them through difficult times.
Yeah. Speaking of that compassionate space, I've often thought, Jesse, no one wants to be unhealthy, mentally. No one wants to fall prey to substance use. No one wants to be sick, right? So, can you talk about some of the reasons, maybe those risk factors or those lack of protective factors that you've seen in your work and your practice that are foundational elements to, that lead to mental and substance use disorders?
Sure. So, yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. Nobody wakes up and says, like, I want to be an addict at age 16 or 20 or 30 or 40, right? We're all just trying to deal with what's in front of us. I think some of the risk factors are really lack of connection, right? Early childhood trauma. We're learning more and more about the effects of neglect or disconnect, not even abuse. Like, it doesn't have to be some huge trauma that we recognize. It can be just not getting what you need in those first days of life, first months of life, first years of life. And that really has a huge effect. I mean, there's some data that shows that if you don't get what you need in the first year of life, the first 12 months of life, but then you get exactly what you need for the next 12 years, you will do worse than somebody who got what they needed in the first 12 months, but didn't get what they needed for the next 12 years. So that first year is really important. And we don't, as a society, do a great job of supporting parents, supporting young parents, supporting parents who have family histories of trauma, There's a lot of marginalization of different groups of people, and that's kind of coming back, right? And showing up in a way that we're starting to see. I think we're beginning to repair a lot of that. But there's a huge effect, and it runs through our genetics, it runs through our relationships, and we don't really support the family, right? So finding ways to help people figure out how to be present, how to be connected, and how to have good, positive relationships in those early days and months of life.
Yeah. I know that you do believe in taking a holistic approach to this crisis. Just speak to what that means. What does that look like?
Yeah. So I think at Bodhi, we really talk about it being really this integration of mind, body, and soul, right? So when I talk about the work I do as a mental health professional with my license, I get that we're looking at emotional health, we're looking at mental health, but I really I feel like I'm a soul worker, right? So I'm working with people to help heal what it is that's been damaged, right? What's been hurt, what's been taken away from them, and helping them find those resources internally to figure that out. So that means making sure that I'm physically healthy, right? I'm drinking enough water, I'm getting enough sleep, I'm getting some exercise, I have healthy relationships. And then it's the emotional stuff and the mental health. What are my thought processes like? How am I talking to myself? How do people around me talk to me? And what am I doing in my life? And then also that spiritual connection, like how do I know that there's something greater than this, or what do I connect with? What does that look like? Whether it's organized religion or some sort of spirituality or naturalism or even atheism, right? If it's something that I believe and I connect with, how do I integrate all that and have it support my well-being? You won't hear me use the word mental illness very much. I don't really believe in that to some extent. I know that there are some things, schizophrenia, certain types of bipolar, other mental health issues that can become very much an illness, right? But at the end of the day, I think for most of us, if we're taking the time to support our mental well-being and our mental health, being preventative and proactive, then we don't necessarily have to face those deeper, darker areas because we're ahead of it. We're taking care of it and we're helping each other.
What strategies have you found to be more impactful with these co-occurring disorders?
Yeah. Well, I tell you, for me, it's really all about relationship, right? So most of the work I do when I'm working with someone, I'm really creating a relationship with them, and that could take years. Really helping them to trust, which is again where like the managed care stuff gets in the way because they want quick solutions. There are some plans that will pay for like 8 sessions. I'm good. I can't solve something in 8 sessions. Like I can set the stage, I can do a little bit of work. But the truth is you're really helping people to create a trusting and equal relationship, even though I'm coming to the table with education and expertise and experience. They're coming to the table with knowledge about themselves and with an understanding of where they want to be and kind of where they are. So we work together to create that. And so there's lots of techniques, lots of strategies, different types of work that you can do. And I think it mostly is a matter of the technique fitting the clinician. So using something that works for you. I think being able to have a good fit between clinician and client, that's really important to us at Bodhi. Making sure that we're working with people that really fit well. And we can get something out of the work too, right? We're both growing as we work together. I learn just as much from my clients as I've ever learned in any book or any study, or it really has grown me as a clinician. And so I think showing up and being present and really reminding myself that the job is to hold space. The job is to create a safe enough space where somebody can say, hey, these are the things that happened. And this is what I told myself about myself when those things happened. And here's how that's played out in my life. How do we change that? What do we do with that? And that's really where the real work is. I think it's slow, it's steady. It can be painful sometimes, but it's really about relationship.
Mm-hmm. Jesse, what process do you guys use in terms of making sure there's a good fit between client and therapist?
That's a really good question. So part of that is kind of on the back end for us. Like we do a lot of work with our clinicians in terms of offering supervision, making sure we're coming together and we're talking about what works well for you. So if it wasn't a good experience, what happened? What was different? What was it that you feel caused the disconnect? And how do we move you towards somebody who's a better fit? So I think the first step in good client and clinician fit is for the clinician to know themselves, right? And to be doing their own work. So we really encourage that. And then really getting a lot of information on the front end. So making sure that our administrative staff that's getting information is getting as much as they can and creating a safe space for people to say, here's what I'm really coming in for. And then we tell clients, if this isn't a good fit, we will continue to work with you to find a good fit, whether that's with us or somebody else in the community. We continue to chip away at that and really addressing and knowing, clinicians come into the field and they're kind of told they should be able to do anything. Well, most of us can't. Most of us have a niche that's a good fit for us. And when you know what that is and you know your ideal client, you can really set the world on fire and do great work. And you see that and part of it is as a practice owner, holding space for that. Sometimes I have to let clients go, right? Sometimes we can't help somebody because they're not a good fit. And being able to let that happen and really walking the walk, right? When I'm talking the talk. And so being able to say, it's not just that I tell you it's about a good fit, it really is. And I'm really going to work for that and try to find ways to keep my clinicians growing and learning, and finding the right people to work with so that we can do this really tough work together.
I think you and I had this discussion off air, but I want you to just kind of talk about it a little more. And it's kind of been our theme today. So you just spoke to ACEs a moment ago, those adverse childhood experiences. So substance use isn't the problem. It's the way of dealing with the problem. And of course, that way of dealing with the problem becomes problematic.
Yep.
Yeah.
As you know, and as with anything, right? So I used to work at a medication assisted treatment in Baltimore. And I would talk to my clients a lot, and they would, show great shame and great stigma around, like, if they had a positive urinalysis, right? So they're testing positive for a drug when they're supposed to be not using, right? And I remember very early on being able to say to them, guys, I mess up every day, all day long. I make huge mistakes. They just don't show up in my urine. Like, that's just not where my problem lies. And that's not the solution that I'm seeking that causes me more problems. But if I catch myself on my phone playing games for an hour, that's a problem, right? Or if I'm being judgmental, or if I'm avoiding relationships, or if I'm exercising too much, or if there are 1,000 ways to put in place a coping strategy that might work once or twice, but doesn't work as the only way to deal with things. You can't keep using a hammer for every single situation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think substance abuse really is that hammer, right? I found something that works. It created some space for my feelings. It took them away. It gave me new ones. It connected me to people that I felt able to connect with, or disconnected me from people that I needed to disconnect from. And it became problematic. That substance isn't the problem. The problem is the reliance on one coping mechanism for all problems. And so I think giving people other ways to deal with it and normalizing that it's human behavior to find something that works and keep using it, even when it doesn't work anymore.
Well, I know that you have your own lived experience. Would you share about your own personal experience in this particular arena?
Sure. So I definitely have personal and professional experience and grief and loss around substance use. I had a favorite cousin, who died in her 30s of a heroin overdose. And then more recently, in 2015, I lost my niece, my sister's youngest daughter, to a fentanyl overdose. And she, like many people, had just come out of rehab, was doing well. All signs looked like she was on the path to recovery and getting it all together. And then she was gone. I also recognize the damage that does to a family, because at the end of the day, I do this for a living. My specialty is non-normative grief. I show up for people who have lost a family member to overdose, and I haven't always been the best resource for my sister or for my other family members as they navigate their grief, because it's really close. I've also lost a couple of clients to overdose, and so it's something that certainly keeps showing up in my life. And when things keep showing up in my life, I'm like, all right, well, I got to do something about this. I have to show up and find a way. So, my cousin and my niece are constantly on my mind. There isn't a day that goes by that I don't think about them. And I hold them close in the sense of recognizing that, again, it's not us and them. I am them, right? I'm one of the people in there, but for the grace of God, go I, because there were certainly choices in my early life that could have led me down that same path if I had had people there to help me. So I think being able to recognize that and hold that and let that be something that sort of guides me forward is a really important part of the work I do.
So when you say, it could have been you, I think about that a lot as well. And it doesn't always seem that it's to do with risk factors or protective factors that save us. I mean, it seems that sometimes, I've seen at-risk youth in certain situations that did just fine, and others are, get kind of caught up into the environment. Why do you think that is? What is the difference there?
I think some of it, so certainly for me, I think I look at that I had very good early foundational connection and a good attachment foundation, right? That kept me kind of
Mm-hmm.
safe through life, even as I explored and connected with people that were maybe didn't have that and were making
Mm-hmm.
choices that put them in positions of danger. I personally, I had trauma in my life from a car accident that happened later. I was like a teenager, so that was already set, and so it was at a different time, and so I interpreted it and internalized it very differently than someone who had those early childhood experiences or first months or years of life. And some of it I think is dumb luck, right? Just by grace of God or whatever we want to call it, you sort of miss something that could have been very damaging. And I think the other thing is that when there are people who can show up, when you have that one, I can think very clearly of people who are very present for me as supportive mentors, as supportive friends, as supportive relationships. And those things really help to direct me and guide me in a very caring and safe way away from poor choices. So I think when people don't have, that's why, therapy is great. And I can't even believe I'm going to say this, but therapy is great, but it's really not the solution. The solution is a connected relationship. And so if I, as a therapist, can offer that to somebody, that's great. But if a teacher can offer that, if a neighbor can offer that, if a grocery store clerk can offer that, whoever can offer kindness and compassion and connection will really help children to go in a better direction, right? That's what makes the difference, that kind of relationship, I think.
Um, would you say, as a mental health provider, that trauma is transferable? And particularly, even with, when we talk about the family unit and, how trauma could even be transferred, is it?
Sure. Wow, that's also a very big question. So I think a couple ways, right? So we have primary trauma, where you experience the trauma yourself. We have secondary trauma, where you witness the trauma, but it's not to you. There's vicarious trauma, where you hear about the trauma and it traumatizes you. And then there's epigenetics, right? So we pass trauma down intergenerationally, and that's a whole, you could do like probably an entire series on epigenetics and the amazing ways in which our bodies turn on and turn off genetic components to be able to prepare us for the world, right? And so if there was a lot of trauma in a previous generation, the infant might be really prepared for a traumatic environment and be sensitized to
Mm-hmm.
that already. But that's a lot of stuff. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but certainly for people who are watching substance use, right? So watching somebody who's struggling with substance use or mental health struggles, there can be secondary trauma in watching that and the pain that comes up around seeing someone struggle, seeing someone hurt, seeing someone trying to figure it all out, and the things that they can do to try to perpetuate that substance use, right? To pay for it and to navigate that world can be very traumatic. Our first responders, our mental health professionals are definitely vicariously traumatized or secondary trauma by the experience of showing up for calls with substance use. first responders particularly are traumatized by having to show up again and again and watching people struggling, right? And not understanding why that person continues to do the same thing, even though it doesn't seem to be working for them. So yeah, it's definitely transferable, I would say.
Yeah. How do we shift the conversation to being more compassionate about this? How can we avoid that urge to stigmatize and shift from a culture of shaming, to being a culture of supporting?
I think, again, it starts with people being aware of themselves and being aware of the reactivity in the sense of wanting to distance ourselves from pain, right? So when we see someone in pain, it's normal to want to push away and say, that's not my experience, that's not my problem.
Mm-hmm.
Part of what we've really tried to do in our county, in our area, by partnering with our county government and with the Department of Emergency Services, is we're really working on lifting the trauma competency of the entire county. I don't want just clinicians to know how to deal with this. Like, I want your average person to drive down the street and notice somebody who's struggling with addiction and at least just not turn away. Like, you don't have to stop and help them if you can't, but at least don't turn away. Just hold them in your heart, give them a little compassion, send up a little prayer or a little bit of meditation in hopes that they'll continue to improve. And I think that actually starts to lift everybody, and we start to recognize that we're not all that different. We all struggle.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So how can someone that does encounter a person and doesn't have any background knowledge or experience, how can they recognize that there may be some mental health or substance use challenges with individuals?
I think when there are behavior changes, right, when you notice somebody's acting very differently, that's worth noting, and it's worth asking, right, to say, what's going on? Like, you seem pretty different. I'm wondering if you're okay. Is there anything I can do to help? I think also recognizing that, again, it can happen to anybody. So being aware of that, I think being connected with whatever resources are in your area. And the more, I wholeheartedly believe that everybody should get therapy. And everybody should be engaged in their own work to better themselves and to grow. And I think the more you're doing that, the more you're aware of when somebody else is off balance. There are a lot of resources. Every area has different resources, and usually you can find them looking through like your county government or the state government to find what those resources are locally. And I think just being willing to ask, being willing to say what's going on, like, something's different here, what's happening.
Mm-hmm. So talk to that individual for a moment that has been struggling with these particular disorders for an extended period of time. And maybe they've decided that they just can't turn their situation around. And maybe they feel like there is no hope or light at the end of the tunnel. What should be their first steps? What do you say to those individuals?
Tell somebody. Like, reach out to somebody, whoever it is. And if that person doesn't listen, reach out to somebody else. Like, continue to fight for yourself, right? Continue to show up and ask. I think recognizing that you're tired, right? When you're in that place where you're just sick and tired of being sick and tired, that's when it's time for change. And as long as you're breathing, there's hope. There's always something that can be done. You can always turn it around. And there's, this is part of your story. If you're going through this, if you're struggling with this, you have a story that can help somebody else down the road. So this chapter that you're going through that's so difficult will be somebody else's hope down the road when you've gotten into the next chapter. So I think you just keep one foot in front of the other, showing up, trying again and again. It takes time to make these changes.
We are about at the end of this segment. Jessie, again, thank you for being here. Are there any final thoughts before we end today?
I think one of the things, I'm just so glad that we're all having these conversations and it's becoming part of, sort of more people showing up and having these conversations. The truth is there are a million ways to end up in an addictive kind of situation. and to be dealing with substances. And we need to make sure that there are a million ways out. So I think everyone who's not struggling with an addiction just needs to find ways to show up for anybody who is, right? And continuing to offer hope and help wherever we can.
Great information. Thank you again for being here. And thank you, our listening audience, for joining us today. We will see you on our next segment of Answering the Call next time.
The Opioid Affected Youth Initiative is deeply committed to supporting the science and community-based efforts to combat the opioid crisis. The discussions that are part of these podcasts support this level of commitment. For additional information regarding the Opioid Initiative, visit us at www.opioidaffectedyouth.org. We also invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel to view upcoming broadcasts, or simply send us an email requesting appropriate links at oayi-info@iira.com.